There are lands in this world that are not merely geographical fragments. They are living wounds, eternal symbols of promises and betrayals of faith and defiance. The Middle East, a small patch of earth through which flows the lifeblood of sacred dreams and unending nightmares, has long been the epicenter of battles, not only for territory, but for memory, identity, and the right to exist. Yet, what few dare to acknowledge is this: the history of this place has been distorted, twisted, and reconstructed over thousands of years. The truth, if told in its entirety, could shake the foundations of what the world holds as certain. And the most critical question, the most earth-shattering one, the one most skillfully concealed through generations, is this: who was truly the first on that land? Who was the first to build an altar, to sow grain, to carve their name into ancient stone? Who was the first to call that land by a sacred name before history was even written? While modern narratives often begin and end with political claims deep beneath the dust of time, ancient bloodlines still whisper. The Palestinian people, a name that resounds like a tragic and contentious note in today's world, are they truly a continuous thread stretching back to antiquity? Do they bear any connection to the names mentioned in the Bible? The Philistines, the Canaanites, those nations that once trod upon that promised land. Does the Bible, with its prophecies and majestic stories, conceal clues about the true origins of those who dwell on this strip of earth? Or have we lost vital pieces of the puzzle due to compromises with the times, out of fear of a truth that might upend what seems unassailable? The story you are about to hear is not merely a history lesson. It is a journey back to the very roots of collective memory, a quest through layers of myth and prejudice to uncover the primal spring that has nourished this sacred land since the dawn of creation. Thousands of years of history have been hidden, and the real question now is no longer who claims this land, but who truly belongs to it. If you think the name Palestine is a modern invention, prepare to have your perspective shifted. For in the very first pages of the Bible, there exist names that echo down to this day, subtle connections that few remember or dare to mention. When the Bible speaks of the land of Canaan, of nations like the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, it is not merely recounting names lost to the past. These were peoples intimately tied to the geography, the heritage, and even the curses and promises of the sacred. But there is another name that stands out among these ancient nations: the Philistines. Warriors from the sea, sworn enemies of Israel in the days of the judges and kings, those who caused Samson, Saul, and David to shed blood. In ancient Hebrew, the word Peleshet, the dwelling place of the Philistines, is the linguistic root of the word Palestine as we know it today. This is no mere coincidence. A fragile yet persistent thread of history binds the battles of Scripture to the blood-soaked conflicts of the modern world. So are the ancient Philistines, the direct ancestors of today's Palestinians. The answer is not simple, but the subtle connection between the peoples of the dawn of time, Canaanites, Philistines, and the descendants still living on that land today is a secret, hard to deny. Blood culture and memory, things not easily erased by war or political decree. What has history told us, and what has it omitted? How many details have been blurred, edited, or buried beneath layers of theories and justifications? As we trace these ancient footprints, we realize that the truth about ownership, about heritage, about the right to exist, cannot be settled by modern treaties alone. It stems from something far deeper, from ancient migrations, from broken covenants, from bloodlines, cursed or blessed at the dawn of history. So, if the Philistines, Israel's ancient foes, are subtly tied to the name Palestine, how does that change the meaning of the struggle for this land? Do we truly know who walked those first fields, who sweated under the scorching sun, who lit the first fires of worship on this soil? Perhaps to understand the present, we must be willing to confront a past far more complex than the simplified history we've been taught. To grasp the current struggle, we must return to the earliest moments when history began to take shape, the era when sacred promises were sealed, when fateful wars first spilled blood on the land of Canaan. That land, according to the Bible, was not an empty wilderness. It was home to a host of ancient peoples: Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, names that echo through the books of Moses and the historical accounts of Israel. Canaan, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River, from Lebanon to the parched Negev, was once the center of metaphysical conflicts between God's promise to Abraham and the complex reality of nations that had lived there for generations. It was here that the Israelites, led out of Egypt, were commanded to take possession of the promised land, not from a void, but from fortified cities and civilizations rooted for centuries. Among these nations, one group stands out: the Philistines. The Old Testament records their formidable presence in the southern coastal cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. These cities later became symbols of enduring conflict, where Israel's kings fought time and again to assert their dominion over the promised land. The Philistines were not a Semitic people native to the region like the Canaanites. According to much research and archaeological evidence, they originated from the Aegean Sea, possibly Crete or the Greek islands, arriving in Canaan during the migration waves of the Sea Peoples around the 12th century BC. But though they came later, they took root deeply and became an inseparable part of this land's history. Linguistically, the Hebrew word Philistines, Peleshet, means invaders or migrants. And from Peleshet, over centuries, the term was transliterated into Palestina in ancient Latin, and later Palestine, the name the world now uses for the region encompassing Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and beyond. Notably, even as the Greek and Roman empires took turns ruling this land, the name Palestine endured not merely as a geographical term, but as a means to erase the Jewish people's claim to their inheritance. When the Roman Empire crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century AD, they deliberately renamed Judea as Syria, Palestina, an attempt to obliterate the memory of the Jewish nation and the sacred promise tied to this land. Thus, the name Palestine across the flow of history is far more than a neutral term. It carries within it deep layers of memory, conflict, and cunning attempts to define who has the right to belong to this sacred land. And as we trace back to that origin, we begin to understand every name, every line in ancient texts is part of a far greater battle, a battle for memory, identity, and the promise from the beginning. In the pages of the Bible, the Philistines consistently appear as dangerous adversaries, threats to the fragile independence of Israel. They are not only formidable warriors, but symbols of a foreign force, both mighty and defiant, challenging God's will for His chosen people. Yet, if we view them only as such, we miss a far deeper story, a story of exile, migration, and a complex process of taking root in the land of Canaan. According to the Bible, the Philistines are prominently featured during the time of the Judges and Kings, from the battles with Samson to the famous showdown between David and Goliath. But their true origins lie far to the west across the Mediterranean Sea. Archaeologists and ancient texts, such as Egyptian records, reveal that the Philistines were part of the Sea Peoples' mighty waves of migration from the Aegean region, possibly Crete Mycenae or ancient Greece, around the 13th to 12th centuries BC. The Mediterranean world was thrown into chaos. Great cities like Troy, Ugarit, and even parts of Egypt were attacked by these migratory waves. Amid this upheaval, the Philistines emerged skilled sea warriors who brought with them advanced metalworking techniques, architectural artistry, and cultural traditions distinct from the local Semites. The Book of Jubilees and other ancient sources outside the Bible suggest they were not merely soulless conquerors. The Philistines carried the memory of an ancient maritime civilization, one that had collapsed but sought to survive by rooting itself on the southern coast of Canaan. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, Ekron. These powerful allied cities were not random strongholds. They were the legacy of an exiled people fighting to carve out a new place in a changing world. In the Bible, the Philistines are often contrasted with Israel. They worship Dagon instead of the Lord God. They trust in weapons and numbers rather than divine covenant. But from a historical perspective, they were also bearers of technical sophistication, a thriving economy, and an organized society. Their settlement in Canaan was not just an act of land seizure. It was a clash of two worlds, the world of survivors of a collapse and the world of those carrying a sacred promise. And that clash became the foundation for some of the most epic stories in biblical history. By understanding the Philistines' origins deeply, we not only unravel a piece of the past, we also begin to see that the struggle for this sacred land has long been more than territorial. It is a battle between two spiritualities, two ways of understanding the meaning of human existence on earth. The battles between Israel and the Philistines recounted in the Bible are not merely fights for land or fortresses. Behind every arrow shot, every sword swung, lies a fierce clash between two entirely different spiritual systems. On one side stands Israel bearing a sacred covenant with God, a spiritual roadmap guiding every step on the promised land. On the other, the Philistines, inheritors of an ancient maritime civilization, worshippers of gods like Dagon, relying on physical strength, craftsmanship, and strategy. In that world war was not just a contest for resources. It was a profound confrontation about how humanity understands its purpose to live under the guidance of a divine covenant, or to rely on human strength to shape its own destiny. Samson, the tragic figure in the Book of Judges, is a vivid embodiment of this simmering conflict. Chosen by God from his mother's womb, sanctified by the Nazirite vow. Samson carried supernatural strength, a symbol of the power God grants to those who live by his covenant. Yet Samson's life was riddled with moments of compromise, times when he was drawn to the outward beauty and allure of Philistine culture. His downfall through Delilah, a Philistine woman, led to the tragic loss of his strength and ultimately his death in a sacred act of sacrifice when he toppled Dagon's temple, destroying thousands of enemies in one moment. In the next generation, this conflict continues through the story of David and Goliath. Goliath, the giant from Gath, was not just a towering warrior. He was a living symbol of Philistine arrogance, trusting in weapons' size and intimidation. Facing him was David, a young shepherd, unarmored, carrying only a sling and 5 smooth stones, but with a heart full of unwavering faith in the power of the living God. David's stone did not merely fell a warrior. It shattered a worldview proclaiming that true strength comes not from swords or spears, but from walking in the shadow of the everlasting one. In each of these encounters, the Bible relentlessly drives home a message. The war in Canaan between Israel and the Philistines is a symbol of the eternal battle between 2 ways of seeing the world. One world is built on covenant, on holiness, on dependence on God. The other is founded on human power, pride, and the forgetting of sacred origins. This war, as we will see, did not end with the pages of Scripture. It continues to echo through every generation, every struggle, every dream over this sacred land. As the biblical narrative draws to a close, as the final chapters of the history of the kings are written, the Philistines seem to quietly fade from the stage. No longer do their coastal armies challenge Israel. No longer do cities like Gaza or Ashkelon ring with their exploits. But did they truly disappear? Or did they merely dissolve into a new stream of history, sinking deep into the land, the blood and the memory of later generations? The truth, as always, is more complex than surface records suggest. According to many scholars, after the conquests of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires in the 8th to 6th centuries BC, the Philistine cities were successively devastated. Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon fell to greater powers. The Philistines were defeated militarily. Their distinct culture gradually faded, but their traces did not vanish entirely. They intermingled with local Semitic peoples, blending into the genetic and cultural flow of Canaan. And from that, blending from the faint continuation of ancient cultures, the term Palestine slowly became a new geographical and political symbol. As mentioned, after crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire, with the intent of erasing Israel's identity, renamed Judea as Syria, Palestina, borrowing from the root of Philistines to mark the end of the Jewish connection to the sacred land. From then on, Palestine was no longer merely the name of ancient invaders. It became the official designation for the entire region, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, regardless of the peoples living there. Through the Byzantine, Islamic, Ottoman, and British colonial eras, the name Palestine endured, becoming the identity for both people and land, despite its origins having blended and transformed over centuries. But at a deeper level, it can be said that in the blood of modern Palestinians, in the culture and heritage, they carry their still echoes somewhere. the memory of those ancient generations, the sea migrants, the coastal cities, the unending wars between forces on this land. The connection between the ancient Philistines and modern Palestinians is not a straight historical line. It is a tapestry woven from migration, warfare, blending, and rebirth. A subtle, unspoken link that persists like an underground current beneath the mire of politics and prejudice. Understanding this, we realize that today's disputes over land cannot be separated from collective memories suppressed for millennia. For sometimes blood and soil history and soul remain tightly entwined despite every effort of time to erase them. When looking at the ancient picture of Canaan, we do not see a clear dividing wall between nations, but a complex tapestry interwoven with migration, war, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. The differences between Canaanites, Philistines, and other Semitic groups in the Bible, though emphasized in sacred texts, are far blurrier in reality when delving into archaeological and genetic layers. The Canaanites, native inhabitants of Canaan, were a Semitic people speaking Northwest Semitic languages, sharing many religious, social, and cultural elements with neighboring peoples like the Amorites, Moabites, and Edomites. Their culture revolved around fortified city-states, rituals worshipping Baal and Asherah, and agricultural practices tied to the rhythms of the arid land seasons. In contrast, the Philistines, as we've seen, came from a starkly different tradition. They brought Aegean metalworking techniques, architectural styles, and even lifestyles distinct from the native Semites. Instead of Eastern agricultural gods, they worshipped Dagon, a god of sea and grain, reflecting their coastal and maritime heritage. Yet despite their differences, interaction was inevitable. Over centuries of living side by side through trade conflict and intermarriage, the Philistines began to absorb Semitic elements. Archaeological studies at Ashkelon and other ancient Philistine cities show a gradual shift from pottery styles and architecture to burial rituals. All bear witness to a blending of two cultural traditions. Genetically ancient DNA analyses reveal that the Philistines initially carried markers of ancestry from southern Europe, aligning with theories about their Sea People's origins. But within a few generations of living in Canaan, their genetics had deeply mixed with local Semites, making them nearly indistinguishable by simple markers. They were no longer absolute outsiders. They became part of the land, its climate, its breath. And so the line between enemy and native blurred in reality. The generations born from these interactions carried mixed blood, bearing memories, tangled between ancient gods, sacred covenants, and the tragedies of contested lands. Understanding this complexity, we see that simple labels like Canaanite, Philistine, or Semitic are only relatively meaningful. The ancient world, like today's, was shaped by waves of movement, encounters, clashes, and compromises that official histories often try to oversimplify. And from those layers of interaction, a truth emerges. No culture exists in isolation. No bloodline is entirely pure. There are only stories, stories interwoven like underground streams, flowing through time, waiting to be heard once more. When it comes to reconstructing the origins of a people, especially in lands soaked with blood and promises like the Middle East, We cannot separate the story from the motives of politics, religion, and power. Each side, each generation tries to redraw the map of collective memory in ways that best serve its goals. Reconstructing the history of the Palestinians or Philistines is not merely the work of neutral archaeologists or historians. It is tied to claims of sovereignty, to calls for return, to efforts to prove who truly has the right to belong to this sacred land. In that context, history becomes a battlefield where stories are cherry-picked, patched together, and sometimes distorted to create narratives just convincing enough to assert legitimacy. For modern Israelis, the connection to the biblical patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, is the sacred foundation for their presence on this land. Every inch of soil, hearsay, every hill, every ancient city carries the mark of the sacred promises etched in Genesis. But for Palestinians, the story is told differently. They emphasize continuous habitation, that their ancestors lived, farmed, loved, and died on this land for thousands of years, from the time of the Canaanites and Philistines to the Islamic dynasties. The debate is not just about who has more archaeological evidence or purer blood. In reality, as we've seen, the blood in this land is a complex symphony of Semitic, Aegean, Aramaic, Arab, and other elements. The deeper debate is this: who has the right to tell the story? Who has the right to define history in their own way and thereby establish today's political and spiritual boundaries? Religion further complicates the picture. For Christians, Jews, and Muslims, this land is not just a physical strip of earth. It is a sacred stage where the great events of faith unfolded. Each religion, each tradition reads history through its own lens, selecting events that fit and silencing inconvenient pieces. In a world where history is often written by the victors, reconstructing origins becomes another war, quieter but no less fierce. And the greatest casualty, perhaps, is the truth. The unadorned, undistorted truth that serves no banner. Understanding this, we must approach the journey into the past with humility and open eyes. For perhaps only by daring to face the complexity, by accepting that there are no simple answers, can we begin to touch the sacred core of this ancient land. If the ancient Philistines and the land of Palestine today are indeed historically linked, whether directly or indirectly, whether vividly or as a distant echo, then the most seismic question is not just about the past. It is about the present. Where is the true boundary between heritage and sovereignty? Who has the right to claim they belong, that they are chosen, that they are the rightful owners of this sacred land? History, as we've seen, does not operate in clean, straight lines. It is a murky current where cultures blend, bloodlines intertwine, and traditions overlap across thousands of years. One nation may claim to be the chosen, but that does not erase the reality that before them others lived, loved, worshipped, and died on the same soil. Likewise, the transformation of a name from Philistines to Palestine is not merely a linguistic matter. It reflects deeper layers of unresolved memory. If today's Palestinians live on land their distant ancestors by whatever name once farmed and built upon, are they truly strangers? If modern Israelis connect their blood and faith to Abraham and God's promise from millennia ago, can they claim absolute sovereignty, or do both hold legitimate pieces of a story far more complex than today's slogans? And there is another, even more unsettling question. Can history be rewritten or forgotten to serve secular ends? Temporary power struggles. We have seen countless times in history how victors not only seize land, but reshape collective memory, erasing inconvenient stories, crafting myths to bolster their rule. But the truth has a strange power. It can be buried, distorted, but it does not die. It continues to echo through archaeological fragments, through forgotten ancient texts, through the very lives that remain, like an unrelenting whisper, reminding us that the right to belong is not determined by strength or numbers alone. The right to belong is rooted in fidelity to sacred memory, in humility before a complex history, and in the courage to face what cannot be controlled. Today, amid the demands to claim land and identity, we are called to reflect more deeply that sometimes holding a land is not just about holding a map, but about preserving a story with all its complexity, pain, and sanctity. To understand the mysterious link between the Philistines and today's contested land, we must return to the very first sacred genealogies in the Bible, where all human lineages were divided after the Great Flood. According to Genesis, Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the ancestors of all nations, and within these lineages the destinies of many peoples were shaped sometimes in profoundly tragic ways. Ham, Noah's 2nd son, is central to a controversial story. After an event described as dishonoring Noah, Ham is cursed, but the curse does not fall directly on him. It falls on his son Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. He shall be a servant of servants to his brothers. Genesis 9:25. This was no mere personal punishment. It cast a shadow over the entire lineage of the Canaanites, the ancient inhabitants of the land that would become the Promised Land. Canaan fathered many descendants: Sidon, Heth, the Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites, names that recur in the Bible as Israel's adversaries. The land of Canaan, from Lebanon in the north to Gaza in the south, became the primary stage for the clash between curse and promise, between Ham's inheritance and Abraham's covenant. But what of the Philistines? In Genesis 10, they are noted as descendants of Casluhim, a branch of Mizraim, Egypt, also of Ham's lineage. Mizraim fathered Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorim. Genesis 10:13-14. This suggests that the Philistines, though arriving as sea peoples, are tied to Ham's lineage in the biblical view. They are a people bearing a heritage both Canaanite and foreign, living on a cursed land, yet wielding tremendous power, challenging even the chosen people of Israel. The connection between Ham's lineage and the southern Canaanite land where the Philistines settled is no coincidence. In the Bible's sacred vision, everything is symbolic. A land of opposition of forces arrayed against God's promise, a land that must be conquered not only by sword, but by fidelity to the divine covenant. And it was on that land, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, that the most legendary battles unfolded, not just between armies, but between two visions of destiny, the destiny of those under the curse and the destiny of those walking in the light of the promise. Understanding this origin, we see that today's disputes are not merely about territory. They are echoes of ancient stories where destiny, grace and fallenness intertwine in a sacred dance beyond what human eyes can see. In the opening chapters of Genesis, a strange scene is recorded, a small event that reverberates through all human history. Noah, survivor of the great flood, plants. A vineyard becomes drunk and exposes his nakedness. Ham, his son, sees this and tells his brothers, but does not cover his father's shame. When Noah awakes, he does not curse Ham, he curses Canaan. Ham's son, cursed be Canaan. He shall be a servant of servants to his brothers. Genesis 9:25. This is no simple moral tale. In the Bible's view, this curse is a divine verdict, a current of destiny that would shape thousands of years of history. Canaan and his descendants, the nations like the Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites, Girgashites, Hivites, became Israel's chief rivals on the path to the Promised Land. Every city that fell, every culture erased, was interpreted in Scripture as the fulfillment of that ancient curse. But the curse was not merely a judgment on the past. It painted a picture of an ongoing war between the lineage of the promise, Shem's descendants through Abraham, and the lineage of the curse, Canaan's descendants. The land of Canaan, flowing with milk and honey, was not merely a material reward. It was a spiritual battlefield where the destinies of opposing lineages collided. The Philistines, though not directly named as Canaan's descendants, bear the curse's mark through Ham's lineage. They are not just military rivals, but living symbols of forces obstructing the fulfillment of God's promise. Every battle between Israel and the Philistines, from Samson to David, is a response to that ancient prophecy that the descendants of the curse would be subdued by those walking in the covenant. Did the ultimate defeat of the Canaanite nations, the disappearance of the Philistines from the political map after the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, mark the final fulfillment of that curse? Many believe so. They see in the collapse of these civilizations the ruin of ancient cities, the scattering of peoples, the traces of a destiny set in motion long before earthly empires dreamed of expansion. But the curse also raises a deeper question. If later generations bear the consequences of their ancestors, how is true righteousness measured? Are all condemned for ancient sins? Or in every generation is there a chance for redemption, a chance to step out of the shadow of the past and rediscover the light of a new covenant? The Book of Jubilees and other ancient texts suggest that personal fidelity can alter the course of destiny. And perhaps in that struggle between the weight of the curse and the call of the covenant, the history of this sacred land continues to be written day by day. When seeking the truth about the Philistines, we cannot rely solely on the pages of the Bible. Other ancient civilizations, Egypt, Assyria, left precious fragments that allow us to see a broader picture of the people who once shook the land of Canaan. In Egyptian records, particularly under Pharaoh Ramses III in the 12th century BC, the Philistines appear in a dramatic context. The famous inscription at the Medinet Habu temple recounts the invasions of the Sea Peoples, a confederation of groups from the Aegean and Anatolia. Among the invaders, the name Peleset, the root of Philistines, is clearly mentioned. According to the account, the Peleset did not come as peaceful travelers. They arrived with warships, weapons and unrelenting ambition. Reliefs at Medinet Habu depict warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses, clad in sophisticated armor and accompanied by families and livestock signs. They sought not just plunder, but permanent settlement. After their defeat by Ramses III, some sea peoples, including the Peliset, moved south, settling on Canaan's coastal plain. From there, Philistine culture took root, developing prosperous cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod. Assyrian records from the 8th to 7th centuries BC also mention the Philistines now as vassal kingdoms, paying tribute to emperors like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II. They were no longer free invaders, but part of the region's political and military machine. Compared to religious accounts, the image of the Philistines in non-biblical texts is far more complex. They are not merely Israel's irreconcilable enemies, embodiments of divine disobedience. They are also sea warriors, cultural refugees, city builders, negotiators and survivors amid the region's turbulent waves. This does not negate what the Bible records. Rather, it adds depth to the historical picture. The Philistines were both real military rivals and theological symbols of what happens when humanity places its strength above the divine covenant. Understood this way, the Philistines are not simple villains in Israel's story. They are a test, a challenge sent to probe the fidelity, humility and faith of the chosen people, and their presence, whether in war or peace, shaped the history of this sacred land in ways few can fully grasp. When the Philistines landed on Canaan's shores after great upheavals in the Mediterranean, they brought more than swords and ships. They carried a culture, a social system, and a vision of world order vastly different from what Canaan had known. Their arrival shook not only the balance of power, but the cultural and religious fabric of the entire region. The Philistines settled primarily on Canaan's southern coast, establishing the famous Pentapolis Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Each city was not just a settlement, but a center of economic, military, and religious power, capable of self-governance and maintaining its own armed forces. This city-state model starkly contrasted with the loose tribal alliances of the native Semites. Socially, the Philistines brought a clear class structure: warriors, artisans, merchants, and farmers. They developed advanced ironworking techniques, surpassing the Canaanites and enabling them to craft superior weapons, quickly establishing military dominance. Archaeological sites like Ashkelon reveal architecture, pottery, and household items, indicating a level of sophistication beyond their contemporaries. Their influence extended beyond the military and economic. Religiously, the Philistines introduced worship of foreign gods like Dagon, god of agriculture and the sea, along with Aegean cultural and religious elements. Temples to Dagon were built in Gaza and Ashdod, hosting sacrificial rituals and seasonal festivals. These foreign elements quickly infiltrated local religious life, causing hybridization and, in the eyes of later Israelite prophets, spiritual pollution. This interaction did not only breed tension. Some Philistine elements, architecture, craftsmanship, artistic styles were absorbed and adapted by the Canaanites. In some ways, the Philistines acted as catalysts for innovation in an already diverse region. Yet from the Bible's perspective, the Philistines' presence was a warning. Every time Israel turned from the divine covenant, they were not only militarily overwhelmed, but drawn into dangerous cultural assimilation. The books of Judges and Samuel recount Israel's lapses into idol worship, each leading to temporary collapse before powers like the Philistines. Thus, the Philistines' presence was not merely political. It was a reminder that the battle for the sacred land is always a battle for its soul, a war fought not just with swords, but with faith, memory, and fidelity to the one who called humanity from the dawn. When the final clashes of swords fell silent, when the ancient Philistine cities were razed by mighty empires like Assyria and Babylon, one might think the Philistine and Canaanite cultures vanished with them. But true history, like an underground river, never stops flowing just because a kingdom falls or a people is erased from the map. The influence of those cultures, Philistine and Canaanite, quietly persisted, seeping into the land architecture, language, and customs of local peoples. Like subterranean streams, they flowed beneath the surface of new identities built over centuries. Many daily practices, farming traditions, and folk beliefs in ancient Palestine bore clear traces of the Canaanite and Philistine eras. Rituals tied to harvests, nature-based worship, seasonal festivals, even some marriage customs carried elements of ancient Canaanite agricultural culture. Language, too, bears silent testimony. Linguists find vocabulary structures and local dialects traceable to Northwest Semitic roots, the foundation of ancient Canaanite tongues. Even as Hebrew, Aramaic, and later Arabic became the region's dominant languages, remnants of ancient speech never fully vanished. Materially, archaeology shows that after the Philistines' political collapse, their pottery styles, building techniques, and some artistic forms persisted, blending with the cultures of successor peoples. Philistine pottery appears in later archaeological layers, signaling quiet continuity, not the total break official histories often describe. Religion, a sensitive realm, also saw the subtle spread of ancient beliefs. Some scholars suggest that forms of fertility, worship water and harvest symbols in Palestinian Arab folk religion may be transformed, continuations of ancient Canaanite agricultural beliefs. This reminds us of a truth. Cultures do not die instantly. They do not vanish because borders shift or conquerors claim victory. They seep, dissolve, transform, and sometimes hide in new forms, waiting for those patient and perceptive enough to hear the faint but persistent voice of the past. In this light, disputes over land ownership and national identity become far more complex, for this land is not just where people live. It is where layers of memory, culture, and the souls of countless generations pile atop one another like sedimentary strata, each demanding to be heard, respected, and recognized as part of a greater story yet to be fully told. In the long history of Canaan, mighty nations rose and fell. Civilizations blazed brightly, then faded into oblivion. But one thing is rarely mentioned amid the ruins. Small groups quietly endured, the remnant people survivors, carrying the memory, blood, and customs of bygone eras. The Bible repeatedly mentions the remnant Canaanites, not wholly destroyed Philistine communities, not entirely eradicated after wars. Today's archaeologists and historians confirm that though ancient civilizations were politically crushed, their people, ordinary folk, continued living, blending and adapting under new regimes. This leads to a quiet but vital truth. The modern inhabitants of Palestine, including today's Palestinians, may carry those ancient bloodlines. They are not sudden apparitions from nowhere. Their lineage, though blended, though changed by history's pressures, may trace back to those who walked ancient Canaan, who farmed its coastal fields, who built small villages under the shadow of temples to Baal Dagon, or even the first altars to the Invisible One. Modern genetic analyses show that today's native Palestinians carry a mix of ancient Semitic elements alongside traces of migrations from Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Arab eras. In their genetic and cultural makeup lie indelible layers of memory, unerasable despite changing dynasties, religions, or languages. Understanding this, we see that the question of belonging to this land cannot be answered by political platforms or religious claims alone. Behind every face, every name, every family here may lie ancient currents connecting directly to those named in the Bible. Yet this heritage is not an absolute ticket to claim sovereignty. For this sacred land, more than any other, demands not just legal ownership, but fidelity to the divine covenants once sealed under its skies. In this light, the Palestinians, quiet heirs of the remnant peoples, are not mere players in modern disputes. They are unconscious keepers of ancient memories, of stories buried under time's thick dust, waiting to be heard with empathy and courage that pierces all prejudice. As we delve deeper into the story of this sacred land's disputes, we confront a question that wars, peace treaties, even modern weapons cannot answer definitively. Which nation was truly given this land by God? And does that divine right still hold after generations of error and betrayal? In Genesis, the promise is solemnly recorded. God tells Abraham, he will give his descendants from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, Genesis 15:18. A vast land flowing with milk and honey, promised to those faithful to the divine covenant. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions all recognize Abraham as the father of faith, but each reads the story through a different lens. In the Jewish lens, the promise passes directly from Abraham through Isaac to Jacob, Israel, and thus to the Jewish people today. Divine sovereignty is tied to the covenant, an unchangeable divine choice. Despite temporary failures, Israel retains the right to the promised land. In the Islamic lens, Abraham or Ibrahim is also the patriarch, but the promise extends to Ishmael, his firstborn, seen as the ancestor of Arab peoples, including Palestinians. From this view, the right to inherit the land is not Israel's alone, but belongs to all Abraham's descendants. Even within Christianity, the question sparks deep theological debates. Some hold that the Old Covenant was fulfilled in the Messiah, and the physical land is now merely symbolic, no longer the spiritual center of faith. Others maintain that the original promise still holds, and the land truly belongs to the chosen people. But beyond theological arguments, an undeniable truth emerges. Divine sovereignty cannot rest on bloodline or armed conquest alone. It demands fidelity to the covenant, proven by righteousness, true worship and justice toward one's neighbor. The real question is, who among today's heirs walks in Abraham's spirit, the spirit willing to forsake all for a promise not of this world? Who among them seeks not just the land, but the kingdom of God, where justice, mercy, and humility reign? For if the original promise was tied to the covenant, then the right to inherit this sacred land in God's eyes may not belong to the strongest, but to the most faithful, and in this world of strife, that may be the true measure of belonging. In the final pages of the prophetic books from Isaiah to Ezekiel, Daniel to Zechariah, a strange thing appears. This contested land is not merely a place, but a focal point of destiny, where history and eternity will meet in a blazing moment of judgment or restoration. The prophets do not describe this sacred land in mere geographical or sovereign terms. They see it as a divine stage where the final events will unfold, where nations will gather, where God's justice will be executed, and where the ancient promise will be fulfilled no longer through a dim mirror, but in radiant light. Isaiah describes a day when Zion will be raised as the highest mountain, and all nations will stream to it. Isaiah 2:2. No more war, no more spears, only righteousness, flowing like a river, and fidelity like an unending stream. Ezekiel, in symbolic visions, sees a new temple built living water, flowing from beneath God's throne, healing the land and nations. He speaks of foreigners, once Israel's enemies, receiving an inheritance in the Holy Land. Ezekiel 47:22-23. A vision challenging all exclusivity or sole possession. Zechariah prophesies a day when all nations will go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts. Zechariah 14:16. A day when the world is no longer divided by blood, race, or religion, but by loyalty to the Holy One. From history to prophecy, a consistent message shines. This land cannot forever be a prize for the strongest. It is the possession of the one who created it, and he will reclaim it, not by violence, but by justice, by the full restoration of the divine covenant. But before that day, the prophets also warn of travail of conflicts, deceptions and judgments that will sweep this land like a final storm. Only those who take refuge in truth, in mercy, in fidelity, will stand when that day comes. Thus the prophet's gaze is not fixed on borders or maps. It pierces the heart of every soul. Are we ready to let go of dreams of possession, to enter the dream of inheriting a kingdom unshakable? For in the final reckoning, this sacred land will not belong to any single empire or nation. It will return to the one who called it from nothingness, and to those from every nation who dared to trust in a promise unbound by borders or time. We often read the stories of Abraham, David, and the battles with the Philistines as closed chapters in an ancient epic, a distant era, where promises and conflicts are mere memories told by campfires. But if we look closely at today's reality, at the painful pulse still echoing on this sacred land, we must ask, are the things recorded in the Bible still unfolding day by day, hour by hour? The promise to Abraham was not just about a piece of land. It was about a lineage, a mission, a covenant relationship between God and humanity, a promise forged in fidelity but challenged by infidelity through every generation. The promised land was not merely a reward, but a crucible where faith must be refined in the fire of suffering, in the trial of conflict. Likewise, the battles with the Philistines in Scripture were not just fights for land. They were microcosms of a greater war between faith and power, between loyalty to the covenant and the temptations of the material world. And that war, though in different forms, still rages on this land. Today, as gunfire echoes over Judea's and Gaza's hills, as walls rise, as claims of sovereignty are signed, and then undone, we witness the continuation of an ancient story, a story of a land too sacred to be simply owned by force, too complex to be divided by artificial borders. The tension between the divine promise and historical reality is a deep fracture. One side longs to continue the flow of grace and covenant. The other grapples with the harsh realities of politics, war, and unhealed wounds. And perhaps deep down, each side carries a piece of the truth and a piece of error for the right to inherit this land. As the prophets showed, does not belong to those with stronger weapons or sharper manifestos. It belongs to those who keep the divine covenant, not in words, but in life, in justice, in mercy, in fidelity to the one who promised. Looking at this torn land today, we see that the lessons from Abraham's, David's, and the prophets' days have never been more urgent, that truth cannot be replaced by strength, and the divine promise cannot be seized by worldly ambition. Amid the roar of the present, the ancient promise still whispers, "I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and as the sand on the seashore. And through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed." Genesis 22:17-18. The question remains, do we living amid this contested land still hear that whisper? As we broaden our view beyond the canonical scriptures, delving into forbidden or apocryphal texts, like the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Jasher, or scattered ancient records passed down through centuries, a larger picture emerges, a picture of a quiet but fierce war between divine promises and human fallenness. The Book of Jubilees, in its detailed recounting, shows that from the beginning the land of Canaan was shrouded in forces opposing God. It describes how Canaan, instead of settling in the land allotted to his lineage, seized the region destined for Shem's descendants, an act seen as defiance of the divine order set after Noah. In the Book of Jasher, we find deeper details of the Canaanites' corruption, their bloody rituals, their cruel acts that defiled the land, compelling God to command Israel to purify it upon entering the promised land. But beneath these texts lies a painful truth. Fallenness was not exclusive to the Gentiles. Even Israel, the chosen people, repeatedly fell into the same temptations, forgetting the covenant, chasing foreign gods, betraying their first faith. These non-canonical texts reveal that the war between light and darkness, between covenant and rebellion, was not fought at city borders, but in the human heart. Every nation, every generation faces a choice: fidelity to the divine promise or surrender to worldly passions and power. And from these texts, we understand that this sacred land was not just a battlefield for armies, but a place where every soul was tested who would hold fast to the covenant, who would crumble before the whispers of power, pride, or forgetfulness. In this light, today's conflict in Palestine-Israel is no mere political or territorial story. It is the continuation of a far older war, the war for the soul of the land of its people of history. Books like Jubilees or Jasher, though pushed to the margins of official scriptures, still echo an unquenchable truth. This land will forever be a crucible of faith. Only those who walk in the light of the covenant in fidelity to sacred truth can truly belong to it, not by force, but by a loyalty proven in every breath, every act. And perhaps that is the true picture of history, a history written not just in swords and manifestos, but in the quiet choices of souls before light and darkness. We have traced the footprints of ancient lineages crossing the dawn of creation, blood-soaked wars and tragedies etched in prophetic words. From Noah's sons scattering after the great flood to Ham's and Canaan's blood, coloring this sacred land from the conflict with the Philistines to modern wars without end. This journey is not merely a trek through old chronicles, it is a passage through layers of memory, through forgotten dreams and covenants still awaiting fulfillment. We have seen that this land has never been just territory. It is a symbol of covenant of fidelity and of the ceaseless silent war between light and darkness. The nations from Philistines to Israelites, from the remnant peoples to modern inhabitants, all carry fragments of that sacred history, whether they know it or not. But looking back, we must face a piercing question. If history has been distorted through centuries of war, power schemes, woven myths and buried truths, how many secrets still lie silent beneath time's dust? How many stories of origins of covenants of souls who walked this land remain untold in their fullness? Perhaps the answers we seek are not on modern maps or in political declarations. They may hide in forgotten ancient texts, in faded inscriptions on stone, or in the very whispers of this land, steeped in pain promises and hopes that never fade. And perhaps a deeper truth awaits, that the one who truly belongs to this sacred land is not the one who seizes it by force or claims it on paper. The one who belongs is the faithful one, faithful to the first covenants, to the promises sealed in tears and blood, to the unyielding demands of justice, mercy, and humility. This journey is not over. It has only begun, and for those brave enough to dig deep, to brush away time's dust, to hear the silent call from the dawn, this land still has much to tell about the past, the present, and a future where justice and grace will meet in light that never fades. Amen.